Thank you, Wim, for that very nice introduction, and thank you to everyone who has sort of tuned in to this webinar. We've got, as well as me, we've got 3 excellent speakers as well, so hopefully you'll find it very useful. Before we go on to my talk, I just wanted, as Cassidy did yesterday, just to remind everyone of the planned outputs from this webinar series, that the webinars will be publicly available on the CIB and UNISDR websites. Also, the plan is that the inputs to these webinars will contribute towards the CIB research roadmap, outlining key areas for research related to hazards in the built environment, and all this will be presented at the CIB World Congress in Brisbane next May in Australia. Also, as part of that, there will be a special session, conference session, and there's a call for papers out at the moment focused on increasing the resilience of cities. And also, the outputs of these webinars will contribute towards the first report of the UNISDR's Making Cities Resilient campaign, and that's something that Cassidy Johnson, who's co-coordinator of the task group, is involved with. Right, with no further ado, the title of my talk, about 15 minutes, is Making Cities Resilient, a top-down multi-stakeholder approach from the United Kingdom. As you can see there, I'm Lee Bosher. I'm a lecturer in disaster risk reduction at the Water Engineering and Development Centre, WEDEC at Loughborough University. The focus of this talk is perhaps a little bit different to what I would normally talk about. I very much advocate grassroots, community-based approaches to disaster risk reduction, but I also believe that those approaches should be supported with governmental or top-down frameworks as well, which actually encourage the grassroots-based work. And therefore, based on the research I've done in the UK and also in other parts of the world, I actually thought there's some work going on in the UK, there's actually an act in the UK, which might provide quite a good framework, which, although very much focused on the UK, could provide some interesting lessons for other parts of the world. The photograph that you can see is a photograph of the town of Carlisle, or the city of Carlisle in northwest. I'll come back to that at the end of my talk. Okay, very briefly, the things that I'm going to cover in this talk is I'll give you very brief information about the UK context, what the hazards and threats are. I'll again briefly introduce the Civil Contingencies Act, which was made an act in 2004, and I believe is a framework for supporting locally relevant actions in relation to resilience building and disaster risk reduction. We'll look at the stakeholder inputs, how stakeholders can get involved, who the stakeholders are, and when their inputs should optimally be made. And then just a few final thoughts, which hopefully, well, I'm sure some of the following speakers, Marla, Daniel, and Rohit, may even be able to answer in their discussions. So the context in the UK. Generally, the UK has not had a history of large-scale disasters. The climate is typically rather benign. I mean, this is in relative terms compared to the large-scale windstorms and hurricanes and floods that affect many parts of the world. We do have some floods, but they tend not to be on the scale that you find in other parts of the world. We don't really have an earthquake problem or volcano problem in the UK, but we do have some hazards and they do have some impacts on people and particularly the economy. So those main natural hazards are coastal flooding, inland flooding, windstorms and extreme temperatures, so very cold or very hot, or actually in the case of the UK, a little bit cold or a little bit hot seem to have big impacts on the UK. These hazards and threats, which are listed here, are determined by the National Risk Assessment, which is undertaken by the government on an annual basis. So we've got the natural hazards and the human-induced threats, which include things such as terrorism, crime, and industrial incidents. So that's the context. In spite of the fact that in the UK we tend not to be affected by massive scale or large-scale disasters, we do have a framework in place which actually helps us to cope with such things, and that is the Civil Contingencies Act. The Civil Contingencies Act was actually in response to what is known as the 4 Fs, which were floods, in 2000, fuel blockades in 2000, something called the foot and mouth disease, which affected a lot of livestock in 2001, and also some strikes by the fire services in 2002 and 2003. So they're what referred to as the 4Fs. And those 4Fs sort of prompted the government to look at the what was then sort of civil protection measures that were in place, and the Act and the accompanying regulations presented here were an attempt to deliver a single framework for civil protection in the United Kingdom to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The Act is separated into two substantive parts: the local arrangements for civil protection, as it's called, in Part 1, and Part 2 is made up of emergency powers. And the overall objective of the Civil Contingencies Act was to modernise outdated legislation. Now, that's all useful context, but what's particularly important, I feel, about the Act is a requirement to proactively identify key stakeholders, or as they're termed in the Act, responders. And I will give you some examples of who those key stakeholders or responders are in following slides. It's also worth bearing in mind that the Act is currently under review, so it may change to some extent. But I think the main thrust of the Act will be pretty much the same. As these webinars are supported by the UNISDR, I actually thought it might be quite useful very quickly to actually look at the Making Cities Resilient campaign and the 10-point essential checklist, which is listed here in this table on the left. And in the right-hand column are the aspects of that checklist which I believe, and also from talking to some of my engineering students and some emergency planners, are covered or encompassed by the Civil Contingencies Act. So things such as putting in place organisation and coordination for dealing with, for increasing resilience or dealing with emergencies and disasters, assigning a budget for that type of work, preparing risk assessments, etc. The Act covers some of those things directly, and that's where the Y is indicated, but also some other things such as maintaining critical infrastructure and assessing the safety of schools and health facilities are covered by the Act indirectly. For example, by some of the stakeholders which the Act sort of brings on board, and I'll explain that a little bit more in the next slides. Just to go back to that one, the key message is that the Civil Contingencies Act, what it espouses, are pretty much in line with a lot of the requirements of the 10-point checklist for the Making Cities Resilient campaign. Although, in spite of that, it's perhaps a surprise that only, I think I checked today, only one UK city has actually signed up to that campaign, and that's Stoke-upon-Trent. Right, so how does the Act actually work? This diagram is a little bit dated now, since what it shows is the national level at the top, the national bodies who have actually written the Act, the regional level, which now, since the new government came in 2010, has pretty much been removed. But what's of particular importance for my talk is the local level, and in particular what are known as these local resilience forums. The local resilience forums were established to maintain effective multi-agency arrangements to respond to major emergencies, so very much about response, but also to minimise the impact of those emergencies on the public, on property and on the environment. So although the Act is very much coined or phrased in terms of responding and what should we do when something bad happens, there are mechanisms in there to support sort of proactive work. Now, how the local resilience forums work are the inputs of these, what are known as Category 1 and Category 2 responders, in inverted commas. I would call them stakeholders or actors, but the Act refers to them as responders, although they are more than responders. Responders sort of indicates that is very much about reacting, but they are actually doing a lot of proactive work up front. And that can include things such as emergency preparedness, but also hazard mitigation. And I'll explain what who some of those responders are next. However, what this framework actually puts in place is it recognises the need for local solutions to local problems using local stakeholders, and those stakeholders can be public and private. So who are these stakeholders? Who are these responders? In essence, they're the local authorities, they're the local councils, and those local authorities and local councils have a number of representatives involved with things such as emergency planning, but also, importantly, urban planning. And as Cassidy Johnson said yesterday, in many global cities, urban planning is not very well integrated with risk management and emergency planning. So this framework, the Civil Contingencies Act, actually provides a forum through the Local Resilience Forum for local authority urban planners to actually speak to emergency planners and a wider range of other stakeholders. The other stakeholders include national and government agencies and the non-governmental agencies, the emergency services, police, fire, ambulance and the like, coastal rescue, search and rescue services. Importantly, also utility companies, and in the UK, this basically means the private sector, and those could be energy providers. There could be people who look after and maintain the national grid, water and sewerage providers, communications providers, but also transport operating companies and those who maintain the transport infrastructure such as roads and rail. And implicit within all these categories are construction professionals. And again, I will give you some examples of who they are later. This is just indicative of the types of stakeholders who are represented in local resilience forums. For example, the local police. Actually, the local resilience forums are actually configured by the local police force constabulary sort of makeup. So the local police who may chair these forums, emergency planners from the local authorities who may also chair these forums, town planners, town engineers, municipal engineers, environment agency, the emergency services or representatives from the emergency services, development agencies, health department in the UK, the National Health Service, transport companies and operators, the Chamber of Commerce who represent the needs and requirements of local businesses, highways and transport agencies, local water utilities, local utilities such as water and energy, but also within that are community groups, and the inputs of those sort of community groups will very much be dependent on what type of issues need to be discussed. So this is just an example. For example, if there's a brand new housing development which needs to be built or rebuilt in a town in the UK, the Local Resilience Forum can meet to discuss what the implications of that new development will be on emergency planning, on the requirements for school numbers, on the impact on health, on whether it has an impact on land drainage and various other things. So it could potentially be a very good forum for dealing with resilience in cities. Now, as there's a key CIB-related aspect to these webinars, I did want to particularly pull out some of the inputs from construction professionals. What this table shows are a list of construction-related and non-construction-related stakeholders. Along the top are phases based on the Royal Institution of British Architects Plan of Work, so pre-project, pre-construction, construction and post-completion phases. And this is based on some research we did a few years ago with a wide range of stakeholders, trying to find out when the optimal input from these stakeholders should be in relation to disaster risk reduction, reducing the chance of disasters occurring from natural hazards and human-induced threats in the United Kingdom. And as you can see, key area is whether it be architects, civil engineers, clients, developers, emergency risk managers, engineering consultants, utilities companies. The key area that their inputs need to be made are in the pre-construction stage. For urban planners and designers, it's clearly in the pre-project phases. But this is particularly important. When we spoke to people, about when their inputs were actually being made on development projects in relation to disaster risk reduction, it tended to be in the construction phase or even in the post-completion phase, which tends to be too late because then you talk about retrofitting rather than designing in. So that's just an example of the wide range of stakeholders and when their inputs could and should be made.
Lee, are you able to finish in 2 to 3 minutes?
Yes, yeah, I'm nearly finished now.
Thank you.
And if they're brought in too late, or if you're talking about existing developments, then obviously you've got this change of use stage at the end when some of these stakeholders have key inputs. So just some final thoughts. As I say, I'm very much supportive of grassroots community-based approaches to dealing with disaster risk reduction and increasing resilience. However, I think those initiatives should be supported by some appropriate top-down frameworks, and this might be an example of that. And the question is a top-down framework really needed? And possibly Marla or Rohit or Daniel might be able to provide some examples of whether that's the case or not. Is the key problem actually more about applying existing knowledge rather than generating new knowledge per se? If so, do we need to get a clearer idea of who these stakeholders and decision makers are? And ideally, the key question is how can we achieve joined-up thinking and convert that joined-up thinking into joined-up actions? Okay, this is my last slide, just to give you, before I finish, a little bit of context to the Carlisle January 2005 floods. In this picture is the city offices, which included a lot of the social support services, the council offices, the emergency planning offices. Over the road were the police station, the ambulance station and the fire station, all flooded, all in the flood-prone area and all flooded, and also nearby was an electricity substation which was taken out of action. It was located in a flood-prone area and also flooded. So what this was through a lack of joined-up thinking and a lack of forethought that this situation was actually a disaster within a disaster. The people whose houses were flooded were then needing support services which could not respond. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this webinar session. Thank you very much.